Tonight, we step away from the noise of the modern world and travel back to the first years of civilian camping. At the beginning of the 20th century, cities were growing louder, darker, and more crowded with every passing year. For many city dwellers, the wilderness began to feel less like a danger and more like a cure. Doctors often praised clean air, sunlight, and open spaces as remedies for tired lungs and exhausted nerves. But going camping was not a simple weekend escape. It began with maps, letters, timetables, and weeks of careful planning. Campers relied on old guidebooks, personal recommendations, and the uncertain memory of those who had gone before. Welcome to Lantern History. If you enjoy calm journeys into the past, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. And before we begin, tell me in the comments which country and city you are watching from tonight. Their idea of wilderness comfort was not light or minimal. It was heavy, careful, and almost domestic. Some trunks were so heavy that the empty box alone weighed more than a modern camper's entire pack. There was no nylon, no fleece, and no waterproof synthetic fabric. Clothing came from wool, cotton, linen, and patience. Even the kitchen came along. Cast iron pans, enamel pots, porcelain cups, and fragile lamps, packed as if the forest were another room of the house. On the morning of departure, the house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a small railway depot. Before a single pine tree could be seen, someone had to move the mountain of luggage. Every trunk had to be carried, balanced, tied down, and trusted to survive the journey. Their peaceful escape began, ironically, in one of the loudest places in the city. At the baggage counter, every extra pound had a price. Routes had to be chosen carefully because the train would only carry them so far. The steam locomotive was the fastest path out of the city and the first trial of the journey. With the trunks surrendered to the baggage car, the campers stepped into hours of coal smoke, hard seats, and hope. Once inside the baggage car, their carefully packed comfort was left to the mercy of railway hands. As the train pulled away, the city began to loosen its hold on them, one smoky mile at a time. Fresh air was the dream, but for the first hours of travel, coal soot often arrived first. Then, slowly, brick and smoke gave way to fields, rivers, and the wide breathing space of the countryside. The romance of travel was tested by hard seats, warm compartments, and the slow ache of sitting still. At the end of the railway line, the journey became older, slower, and far less predictable. Local guides understood the forest in a way no city guidebook ever could. The wagon had to be loaded like a puzzle, because one badly balanced trunk could turn the road into trouble. To the villagers, the idea of sleeping in the woods for pleasure must have seemed wonderfully strange. The road beyond the village was not a road in the modern sense. It was earth, stone, dust, and patience. A little rain could turn the final miles into a slow negotiation with mud. At last, the road ended. From here, the wilderness would have to be entered slowly, one burden at a time. The wagon could carry them no farther. From this point on, every comfort had to be lifted, dragged, or carried by hand. A badly tied rope could mean a lost blanket, a broken lamp, or a trunk sliding down a hillside. The heaviest pieces were given to patient animals, though even they seemed to question the city people's idea of comfort. The path was not made for leisure. It was made by feet, animals, weather, and time. Stiff leather boots protected the feet, but comfort was rarely part of the bargain. A single loose strap could slow the whole party and remind everyone that the forest rewarded careful hands. Then, through the trees, they heard the sound every camper hoped for: running water. A river meant drinking water, washing water, cooking water, and the possibility of staying. A good camp needed water nearby, level ground beneath, and enough distance from the river to survive a rainy night. Before a tent could rise, the forest floor had to be negotiated branch by branch, stone by stone. The tent was not a lightweight shelter. It was a folded canvas house, stubborn before it even stood. Even spreading the canvas required cooperation, patience, and a willingness to wrestle with fabric heavier than it looked. The frame was made of wood, strong, simple, and heavy enough to remind the campers of every mile behind them. To raise the ridgepole was to turn a pile of cloth and wood into the promise of a night's shelter. In a breeze, the canvas behaved less like a tent and more like the sail of a small, unruly ship. Every stake had to hold, because the first night wind would quickly expose a careless hand. In camp, a good knot was more than a trick. It was shelter, safety, and dignity. Inside, the canvas carried its own scent: oil, fiber, weatherproofing, and the faint memory of storage rooms. Unlike modern tents, many shelters had no sewn-in floor. Beneath the canvas, the forest was still the floor.
The ground sheet made a boundary, thin but important, between civilized sleep and the cold, breathing earth.
Once the shelter stood, the campers tried to make the inside feel less like forest and more like a room. Warmth came from weight: wool blankets, canvas rolls, and layers thick enough to press the body into sleep.
The trunks became cupboards, tables, benches, and the fragile walls of a temporary domestic order.
Light, after sunset, would depend on glass, brass, oil, and a wick no thicker than a finger. Before evening fell, every rope had to be checked, because night would test the work in silence. A campfire began long before the first flame. It began with the patient search for dry wood. Dry wood cracked cleanly. Damp wood only bent, smoked, and made beginners cough. For city hands, an axe was not a symbol of romance. It was a tool that demanded attention. A fire had to warm the camp without threatening the very canvas meant to protect it. A dry match could feel like a treasure, because without fire the forest became colder by the minute. Before the match was struck, the first flame needed a little architecture of bark, needles, and air. The first flame was small, uncertain, and treated with the seriousness of a ceremony. When the tinder caught, the camp changed. The clearing became warmer, safer, and somehow more human. Damp wood did not burn so much as argue, filling the air with smoke, before offering any warmth. After hours of travel and labor, the fire gave them the first true feeling of arrival.
Water had to be fetched by hand, cold from the river, and heavy on the walk back.
Soon the first kettle would warm, and with it the tired silence of the camp. The cast-iron skillet was heavy enough to resent, and useful enough to forgive. Supper was simple, salty, and deeply welcome after a day spent carrying comfort into the woods. Food could not sleep beside people. In the forest, every smell was an invitation. Before sleep, the food had to be lifted away from the ground and away from every curious nose in the forest. Pull it steady now, Edward.
Large animals were only part of the worry. Smaller thieves could chew through cloth with astonishing determination.
The first meal in camp was not elegant, but hunger made every bite feel generous.
Enamel plates chipped easily, but in the woods they felt almost luxurious, compared with eating from the hand. Then came tea, hot enough to warm cold fingers, and quiet enough to end the day.
Beyond the fire, the forest remained vast and dark. Within the circle of light, the camp felt almost like home. Without modern detergent, sand and clean ash became the evening's quiet kitchen tools. The iron had to be dried and oiled, because even a useful pan could suffer in damp night air. Before anyone slept, the fire had to be made safe, watched down from flame to quiet coal.
Inside the tent, one small flame turned canvas walls into a room of moving shadows.
The lamp made every movement larger than life, stretching ordinary figures into quiet silhouettes.
Even after such a long day, a few words were written down, as if the forest had to be preserved before sleep.
There were no zippers, only flaps, ties, knots, and trust in the work of the evening. The bedrolls were heavy, rough, and warm, pressing the tired body down toward rest. When the lamp went out, the little canvas room surrendered itself to the night. Outside, the forest did not sleep. It breathed, rustled, flowed, and whispered around them. At first, every small sound seemed important. A twig, a leaf, a breath of wind against canvas. Slowly, the strange sounds became familiar, and the forest turned itself into a lullaby. Morning arrived not with comfort, but with a cold blue light pressing gently through the canvas. The first morning in camp began with stiff backs, cold fingers, and the sudden memory that there was no warm bathroom waiting nearby. The first task of morning was simple enough. Open the tent and let the cold world back in. With no bathroom nearby, morning cleanliness began with a short walk through wet grass and pine needles.
The river looked peaceful, but the first touch of water was sharp enough to wake the entire body. Soap was firm, plain, and stubborn in cold water, and linen towels offered more discipline than softness.
For the gentleman, even the wilderness did not excuse an untidy face. The straight razor had to be sharpened with patience, because one careless motion could leave a memorable morning mark. To shave in the open air was to balance dignity, cold fingers, and a very sharp piece of steel. Toothpaste often came as powder, chalky and dry, carried in little jars rather than tubes. Hair was not washed each morning. It was brushed, arranged, pinned, and persuaded back into order.
Even in the forest, composure mattered. The wilderness could be endured, but not necessarily untidiness.
Wool warmed the body, but in damp morning air it could feel cold before it felt kind. The boots had rested overnight, but they had not softened. Each morning, they had to be convinced again. A wise camper did not begin every fire from nothing. Sometimes, morning warmth was hidden under ash. Breakfast began with the familiar sound of a trunk opening and the careful search for useful things. The skillet warmed slowly, gathering heat from the fire until breakfast could finally begin. Salted meat and potatoes were plain food, but after a cold morning, plain food felt wonderfully sufficient.
If fresh eggs had survived the journey, they were not breakfast. They were a small miracle.
Before coffee could comfort anyone, the beans had to be ground by hand, one slow turn after another. The coffee was strong, dark, and simple, boiled close to the fire until the whole camp smelled awake. At last, the camp was warm. The coffee was ready, and the first full day in the forest could begin. Breakfast ended, but the work did not. In camp, every meal left behind a small duty. To go walking in the woods did not mean dressing casually. Respectability followed them, even beneath the pines. Edward's jacket was designed for the outdoors, though not for the kind of comfort a modern hiker would expect. Clara's clothing was elegant, durable, and not especially forgiving when the path grew narrow. Henry did not intend merely to walk through nature. He intended to classify it.
Eleanor carried a diary, because a day in the forest was not complete it had been remembered.
Thomas read the morning in clouds, wind, damp leaves, and the sound of water over stones. With the camp in order, they stepped away from shelter and into the day's small discoveries. The forest changed the light around them, turning morning into a green and quiet room. To the amateur naturalist, a fern was not simply a fern. It was a clue, a specimen, and a conversation.
Leaves were pressed between pages, so the walk could later be unfolded again at home.
Through a little brass lens, the forest seemed to become larger, stranger, and more carefully made. Even the smallest creatures drew attention, moving through bark and shadow with their own quiet purpose. Collecting insects was fashionable, though not every camper was equally convinced by the habit.
The flowers were admired as discoveries, souvenirs, and sometimes simply as a reason to stand still.
Often, the birds were heard long before they were seen, their songs moving through leaves like invisible threads. Field glasses brought the branches closer, though they also reminded the arms that science could be heavy.
A fallen feather could become a keepsake, light enough to carry the memory of a whole morning.
The walk grew steeper, and the forest began to show what lay beneath it: stone, root, and age. To Henry, a bright piece of quartz was not just a stone. It was proof that the day had offered a discovery. Some campers carried small hammers, not for building, but for asking the rocks a few careful questions. Of course, each discovery had to be carried, and the pockets grew heavier with every new wonder. Curiosity made the walk richer, but it also made it heavier. After hours of discovery, even the most enthusiastic explorer needed a quiet place to sit. Heavy clothing and salted food made thirst arrive quietly, then insistently. By afternoon, the question was no longer what else they might find, but how far they still had to walk back. When the white canvas came back into view, it no longer looked temporary. It looked like shelter. The day's discoveries were laid out like treasures, though some were little more than stones with excellent stories. By mid-afternoon, the camp grew warm, and the weight of formal clothing became impossible to ignore. The river served as a kind of natural icebox, useful, beautiful, and never entirely trustworthy.
Butter was a delicate luxury. If it survived the afternoon, supper already felt more hopeful.
The river can rise to here. A sudden rain upstream could turn a clever food cache into a floating supper. Where the river could not help, damp cloth and moving air offered a few precious degrees of relief.
The cooler worked only if someone remembered it, again and again, through the warm hours.
A single grain of sweetness was enough to announce the kitchen to an entire miniature world. To stop ants, the table was given a little moat, as if the kitchen had become a tiny fortress. That should do it.
A clever little moat. Flies were not dramatic visitors, only persistent ones, returning whenever attention wandered.
Canned food promised convenience, though opening the can could feel like a small mechanical contest. Before the easy pull tab, a tin of food asked for patience, strength, and a little courage. By late afternoon, the question returned in its simplest form. What could the forest, the river, and the trunks offer for supper? If supper was to improve, the river would have to offer something fresh. The rods came apart for travel, but even assembled, they were still long, delicate, and surprisingly heavy. Before modern fishing line, silk had to do the work, and silk demanded care. The line had to be dressed before fishing, or water would make it heavy, weak, and difficult to cast. Look at these, Edward. Artificial flies were miniature inventions made to persuade a fish that thread and feather were alive. Henry preferred the elegance of artificial flies. Thomas trusted whatever the river was already feeding. The best fishing place was not far, but every rod, box, and basket made the walk feel ceremonial. The river bend was quiet enough to make every movement feel important. To cast well required timing, patience, and the ability not to look too foolish while learning. Henry cast as if performing an experiment, which, in a way, he was.
Not everyone needed to hold a rod. Sometimes the river itself was enough to occupy the mind.
Dusk brought the smallest and most persistent residents of the riverbank. Fishing taught a lesson the city rarely allowed. Stillness could be work. Then the line moved, and all the quiet patience of the river gathered into one small pull. With silk line and bamboo rod, strength mattered less than restraint. The trout was not large, but after so much waiting, it seemed entirely sufficient. The fish was kept cool in damp grass, a small silver promise for the evening meal. A second fish made the meal feel less like luck and more like success. The romance of fishing ended with practical work, done beside the same water that had given the meal. They returned to camp. They returned with tired feet, cooler air, and supper swinging gently in a willow basket. Back at camp, the river's gift was carried into the warm circle of the fire. The fish needed little: a clean cloth, a pinch of salt, and the patience of a fire already glowing. When the butter touched the hot iron, the whole camp seemed to grow more hopeful. The trout browned slowly, filling the clearing with a smell no tin of provisions could imitate. The table was only a trunk, the chairs were only logs, but the meal felt earned. For a few minutes, no one needed to carry, mend, calculate, or plan. They only needed to eat. Even the quietest supper had to vanish properly, or the forest would notice what was left behind. Food scraps were not waste in the woods. They were messages, and every animal knew how to read them. Above the ground, the food waited in the dark, just out of reach of the forest floor. The next morning, the camp felt less like an experiment and more like a small life of its own. After enough meals on logs and stones, even the most romantic camper began to think about furniture. The forest could provide the wood, but comfort required tools, skill, and a certain respect for sharp edges. The best camp furniture often began not with a living tree, but with wood the forest had already let go. The first cut was slow, uneven, and deeply satisfying, in a way office work rarely was. A three-legged stool made sense on uneven ground, where four legs could argue with every root and stone. This alignment seems correct. Without electric drills, every hole was turned by hand, slowly, firmly, and with no guarantee of perfection. When the legs finally entered the holes, the little stool looked both promising and suspicious. The first test required courage, balance, and a willingness to trust. 3 pieces of forest wood. Once someone could sit comfortably enough to write, the stool became an instant triumph. With one stool complete, ambition grew. A proper table now seemed possible and necessary. A camp table began with 4 branches that looked straight enough to be trusted. The posts had to stand firmly, or the table would become a lesson in gravity. A good lashing could replace nails, if the hands tying it knew what they were doing. The tabletop was never perfectly smooth, but in camp, flat enough was often a victory. Piece by piece, the camp gained another small sign of civilization. When the cup did not slide away, the table was judged a success. A linen cloth over rough wood was enough to turn a construction project into a dining room. A cooking tripod was simple in theory: 3 poles, 1 knot, and enough truss to hang supper above the fire. When the kettle hung safely, the camp kitchen felt suddenly more official. Even boots needed a place of their own, close enough to dry and far enough not to burn. A clothesline brought a little order to the wilderness and announced that the camp intended to stay. Wool dried slowly, and if placed too close to the fire, it offered a lesson in regret. The forest loosened knots, straps, buttons, and sometimes the habits people had brought from home. Every new piece of furniture came with its own little argument from the wood. Tools had to be cared for before the evening damp found them. By degrees, the clearing became a settlement, temporary, handmade, and deeply satisfying. When the hammering and sawing stopped, the camp fell into the soft quiet of earned rest.
Eleanor wrote while the light was still kind, before evening took the page away.
Edward described the wilderness with dignity, leaving out most of the mud, smoke, and sore feet. A single leaf could become proof that the day had happened exactly as they remembered it. Henry gave each little object a place in his notes, as if the forest had become a private museum. Ink demanded patience. Every line needed time to dry, even in the middle of the woods. Postcards made hardship look charming, especially when written before the blisters had fully complained.
A letter from camp travelled slowly, but it carried more weight than any quick message could.
Even in the forest, a letter could leave with ceremony. The letters would wait for the next journey to town, patient as everything else in camp had to be.
As the sun lowered, the canvas caught the light and made the whole clearing feel softer.
One by one, the day's little tasks were finished, and evening took possession of the camp. Nightlight depended on small preparations: a trimmed wick, clean glass, and enough oil to last the evening. When the first lamp glowed, the camp became a small island of gold in the blue of the forest. Too much wick made too much smoke, and even light had to be managed with care. A simple tin of food could still demand strength, patience, and a steady hand. Canned beans were not glamorous, but in the evening cold, they promised warmth. By lamplight, even the simplest meal became a small ceremony. The lamp did not only invite people to supper, it invited half the tiny night as well. Tea softened the edges of the day, warming hands that had worked since dawn. Nothing could be left carelessly behind. In the forest, even crumbs had consequences. As the air cooled, conversation moved naturally toward the fire. After supper, the trunks offered one more comfort from home: music. The forest air had its own opinion about tuning, and the instrument had to be persuaded back into harmony. Then the guide produced a harmonica, small enough for a pocket and large enough to change the evening. The music was not polished, but it belonged perfectly to the fire, the dark, and the tired company around it. No one sang loudly. Past the shadows deep,
The stars begin to peep.
the stars begin to peep. The forest seemed to ask for gentler voices. A wrong note did no harm. In the woods, even imperfection sounded companionable. After music came stories, spoken low enough that the dark seemed to lean in and listen. So we all sat around the fire. In firelight, faces became softer, older, and somehow more honest. A single twig beyond the light could remind everyone how large the forest still was. Sometimes the forest answered not with danger, but with a pair of quiet eyes at the edge of the light. When the story ended, no one hurried to speak. The silence after it was part of the telling. The fire sank lower, and conversation softened with it, until even words began to feel unnecessary. The music was put away carefully, as if even the last note deserved a place to sleep. The last conversations of the evening were small, warm, and easily swallowed by the trees. Before sleep, the food was checked again, because the forest had a long memory for smells. The fire was not simply abandoned. It was quieted, covered, and trusted to behave until morning. One by one, they left the circle of coals and carried the evening into the tent. At the tent flap, the day was left behind in the form of mud, leather, and tired feet. Sleep in camp did not begin with comfort, but with the careful removal of just enough layers to rest. Even hats were put away with care, as if order itself helped keep the wilderness outside. Edward placed his glasses beside the watch, as if both sight and time could rest until morning. Before sleeping, Eleanor protected the day's words from the dampness that crept into everything. Henry's discoveries were put away like valuables, though most of them had been found underfoot. Outside, Thomas trusted sleep only after the ropes had answered his hand. The lamp was lowered slowly, until the tent became less a room and more a shadow. The blankets were rough, heavy, and warm enough to make movement seem unnecessary. Outside, the little settlement grew still, while the river continued its quiet work. Above the forest floor, the provisions waited through the night, tied to a branch and to common sense. Sometime in the night, rain arrived gently, first as a whisper on the canvas. Old canvas had one rule in wet weather: touch the walls. Do not touch the walls. Hemp rope changed with weather, and rain could loosen what evening had tied so carefully. By morning, the rain had passed, leaving the camp damp, fragrant, and very much still standing. The morning after rain was a morning of inspection. Canvas, rope, wood, and earth all had to be understood again. Water had gathered in folds and seams, and the first small chore was simply to persuade it back to the ground. The boots had survived the rain, but they had not become kinder. Wool held warmth well, but it also held dampness with remarkable loyalty. A wet morning fire was a negotiation between patience, dry tinder, and the memory of last night's heat. Damp wood did not hurry into flame. It preferred to announce its reluctance in smoke. After rain, hot porridge was less a meal than a reassurance. The table was damp, the ground was damp, and yet breakfast made the camp feel cheerful again. The rain had raised the river just enough to remind them that even a clever storage place needed checking. The butter had survived the night, which felt like a small victory over weather and water. Rain had filled some cups and muddied others, so the tiny moat around the kitchen had to be restored. Paper was as vulnerable as food. A damp letter could lose its dignity before it ever reached town. Rain made the small world brighter. Moss, bark, and stone seemed newly written. Even after rain, the forest kept a few dry secrets beneath its thickest branches. Anything left outside became part of the weather, including the cups. By late morning, the sun returned, and the camp began to exhale its dampness. Rain was hard on metal, and tools had to be cared for before rust began its quiet work. Rain changed wood and rope just enough to remind everyone that handmade comfort was never finished. The naturalist treated even a swollen rope as evidence, because the camp had become a classroom. By afternoon, tea returned the camp to order, and the rain became only another story the clearing had absorbed. After the rain, the camp seemed to shine a little, as if every rope, blanket, and branch had been washed into usefulness. The blankets came down from the line heavier than modern bedding, but dry enough to promise another warm night. Even here, where the river and sun kept their own time, Edward still wound his watch. Henry drew the camp as if it were a settlement worth recording, because by then it almost was. Evening warmth began in the afternoon, with wood chosen before the shadows reached the clearing. Small twigs mattered most at dusk, when a reluctant fire could make the whole camp feel colder. Supper began plainly, with potatoes, a knife, and the quiet patience of hands that had learned the camp. Water was never simply available. It had to be carried, and every full pail announced its weight. The cooking tripod turned the fire into a kitchen, and the pot began to gather the evening together. Even hard bread became friendlier when warmed near the fire and given a little butter. The stew was simple, but it had the deep comfort of something made slowly after rain.
Feel.
After every meal, the table had to become clean wood again, before night came looking for crumbs. The food rose into the branches once more, leaving the ground to the night creatures. Before night settled completely, They walked a little beside the water, simply to feel the day loosen. For a moment, the river needed no use. It was not for washing, cooling, or cooking. It was only beautiful.
The first star appeared before anyone announced it, a small point of order above the darkening trees.
They returned to the fire not because they had to, but because warmth had become the center of the evening. On a clear night, the lamps were not for fear, but for the small comforts of seeing one another. Before sleep, the little signs of the day were set aside: glasses, hats, notebooks, and time itself. Above the canvas, the sky cleared completely, and the forest settled into a silence deep enough for sleep. Morning returned quietly, not through a clock or bell, but through pale light pressing against the canvas. Edward began the day by recovering his sight, and with it, the little order of the morning. Clara restored her hat with the same care she might have used at home, though the floor beneath her was still forest. Henry checked his notebook before breakfast, because yesterday's discoveries had to survive the night as well. Eleanor's diary had kept its pages dry, and the day could safely continue from where the last one had ended. Outside, the clearing felt washed clean, and the camp waited with all its small duties. Thomas was already awake, as if the forest had spoken to him before the others opened their eyes. After a dry night, the fire came more willingly, as if yesterday's rain had already become history. Coffee returned to the camp like a familiar visitor, dark, bitter, and deeply welcome. After damp mornings and smoky fires, bread with a little jam felt almost extravagant. The letters were finally ready for town, carrying polished versions of a very unpolished life. Thomas left for town with the letters, and the camp felt briefly more alone. Without Thomas, the clearing seemed the same, and yet every rope and shadow felt a little more important. Edward tried to remember Thomas's lessons, discovering that dry wood was easier to name when Thomas was nearby. Clara brought order to the food table, proving that camp management was its own kind of wilderness skill. Rain had written the night's visitors into the mud, and Henry was delighted to read the signatures. Eleanor used the quiet to write, though the silence felt different when the guide's footsteps were gone. Without Thomas, even the kettle seemed to require more judgment than anyone expected. By afternoon, they began listening for Thomas, though no one quite admitted they were waiting. When Thomas returned, the camp seemed to relax, though nothing visible had changed. Thomas Reed returned with little things from town, and each one seemed larger in the wilderness.
Fresh bread, after days of hard camp loaves, felt almost ceremonial.
These will keep us going. In camp, a few dry matches were not an afterthought. They were security.
With more lamp oil, the coming night promised a little longer circle of light. The newspaper brought the city back for a moment,
though its urgency seemed smaller beneath the trees. News from town could be read, folded, and set aside. The river required no opinion. Every new item had to find its place, or the camp would quickly become confusion.
Look here, a few fresh eggs for us. A few fresh eggs could transform tomorrow's breakfast into a luxury. Even restocking required arithmetic, because the nearest shop was no longer just around the corner. With bread from town and a little confidence from experience, supper felt less like survival and more like a ritual. The bread was ordinary in town, but in the forest, it seemed to carry all the comfort of a kitchen. The last slice was divided carefully, not because it was rare, but because it was shared. As sunset reached the clearing, the table returned to order, ready to disappear into night. By now, even hoisting the food had become part of the rhythm of evening. The lamp was lit again, and the camp became a small golden room without walls. By lamplight, the newspaper became less a report from the world than another object in the camp. The city was folded away again, and the forest resumed its place around them. The supplies were stored, the news was folded, and the fire asked nothing more of them. Night began again with small acts of order. A hat set down, a diary closed, a shawl drawn close. Edward Whittaker set down his watch and glasses once more, leaving time and distance to the quiet of the tent. Inside the tent, the last comforts of the day were arranged with quiet, careful hands. The little discoveries were put to sleep, as carefully as the people who had carried them. The lamp was lowered until the tent held only enough light to say goodnight. Outside, one final round was made before the camp could be trusted to the night. The canvas flaps were tied shut, and the forest became a sound rather than a sight. At last, the lamp gave up its little circle of gold. In the dark, the little rooms of canvas became breath, wool, and silence. The fire ring held the memory of warmth, glowing faintly beneath ash. The river continued as it had all day, carrying the dark gently past the sleeping camp. Above the tents, the sky opened wide, indifferent, ancient, and full of quiet light. The food slept above the ground, tied into the branches by habit and caution. The ropes held through the night, each one carrying a little of the camp's trust. Somewhere beyond the tents, an owl kept its own watch over the dark. Under wool and canvas, the day finally released them. The canvas moved with the breeze, soft as a breath, keeping the forest just outside.
What had seemed strange on the first night now sounded almost like a welcome. The last red coal gave itself to ash, and the work of the day was finished. Slowly, the little camp became part of the dark forest around it. From across the water, the tents were only small white thoughts beneath the trees. And now, with the river still moving and the canvas resting in the dark, we leave them to sleep. Good night.